America is nowhere close to being in a second civil war. My name is Samuel Ronan, and I am running for President of the United States in the Republican primary. And let me tell you why America is nowhere close to a second civil war. Why did we fight the first civil war? And what led to us fighting that first civil war? For the most part, it was about states' rights to have slaves. And everything else was secondary. But primarily it was the right for states and people in general to own, sell, and acquire more slaves. And this was enough of a rallying cry to generate so much discontent, anger, and hatred between the states that it led to a civil war. But that hatred is not nearly enough to create a war, to create true civil unrest. We've had plenty of civil unrest in America. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the nation burned for several days, and Congress finally passed the Civil Rights Act. When George Floyd was murdered in broad daylight while two officers watched and did nothing for 10 minutes, the nation rose up in outrage, anger, and betrayal. How could our law enforcement do this to us, to a citizen? Extrajudicial murder for a potential counterfeit 20? We're committing war crimes by aiding and abetting Israel. We have a large anti-war movement happening, but no further action. There was all sorts of protests against the Trump administration, no further action. There is currently a whole lot of support for the Trump administration against the Biden administration. Still, nothing happening. And the reason, or the major difference between the present and the past, is organization. You see, the people who led our nation to civil war from the Confederacy created organization, created infrastructure, had leadership, had the means and resources to galvanize the states to take military violent action against the North. And of course, the North was regular America with the federal government in tow, which had our military, our resources, and our people at the ready. We don't have that. We've been quote-unquote homogenous for far too long to have that kind of divide, despite all of the Confederate flags and the statues and the South will rise again. There is not enough vested interest on either side to actually engage in violent conflict. So we will never have a civil war. We will likely only ever have protests and riots that will be quickly put down by police using illegal tear gas against citizens, potentially illegally arresting and murdering them as well. Because protesting is covered by the First Amendment in our Constitution, but it doesn't say it must be peaceful and not be inconveniencing anyone under any circumstances. It says the right of the people to protest and air their grievances to their government shall not be infringed. And yet every single time there's a protest or a riot or some sort of outrage against our government, it is met with brutal violence and overwhelming force. So in order for a civil war to happen, we as a people would have to be united under a common cause. We would have to be organized under a common cause, and we would have to have leadership ready to take that organization under that common cause and direct it. Now, whether that's a civil uprising against the federal government, whether that's the South versus the North, whether that's the left versus the right, it doesn't really matter. Organization, infrastructure, and leadership is what's lacking, as well as motivation. So rest assured, we will not have another civil war in our country. But that doesn't mean our country is not in danger, that the soul of our nation is in peril, that the very society, the infrastructure, the hierarchies, the government, the economy, the everything is not vulnerable. And we saw this during the COVID government shutdown in 2020. For 2 months, workers were forced home. And the GDP dropped by 34%. That should have been America's labor revolution, workers' reform. But it wasn't. Because the powers that be convinced all of us that we needed to go back to work, that we wanted to go back to work, that we wanted to go to movie theaters and parks and travel and this, that, and the other things that you probably never even chose to do in the past. But now it was in the news. Now it was being shouted from every single microphone and speaker and screen that our freedoms are in peril and this is oppression. And now we have the greatest wealth inequality in history, greater than even 1789 France during the French Revolution and the invention of the guillotine. This is worse than the Great Depression. If this disparity, these social injustices, these economic injustices, the fact that we are aiding and abetting Israel and committing genocide against Palestine, if these things, the blatant corruption in Washington, the legalized bribery that is lobbying, the money is free speech, the fact that police can murder you at a traffic stop because they feared for their lives, or take all of your worldly possessions for no reason whatsoever. If these atrocities and these oppressive actions and war crimes and crimes against humanity are not enough to cause the American people to unite under common cause, to hold their elected leaders accountable, then what is? And until such an event and a tipping point occurs, there is going to be no civil unrest. There is going to be no national movement, no revolution, and no civil war. All we are going to see is more of our rights, more of our freedoms be eroded, our way of life destroyed, our economic strength dwindling and eroding and taken away, our choices removed, our freedoms absolutely diminished, our voices silenced, and our ability to influence political change erased.